Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today we are going to look at how we quantify labor supply. Now for reference, you should pair this video with readings in Chapter 2 of your textbook, noting that much of the information has been updated for this video. I also suggest taking a look at the Guide to the Labor Force Survey before doing any empirical work on the Canadian labor market. Now, most of Chapter 2 is about building a framework for how we think about decisions made by individuals. But first, we want to pin down a few definitions and offer a few figures to characterize people's attachment to the labor market in Canada. Now, we always have to start by defining the population we are interested in studying. That is true in any research that we do. Are we watching everyone from infants to the elderly in care homes? Not usually. So we usually start by defining an eligible population. So we're looking for who are those potential labor force participants. Now, we often start by defining what age range we're looking for. Normally, the age we're looking at is 15 and over. We might narrow that a bit to think about a core labor market, age 25 to 54, for example, in various pieces of work that we will look at over the course of the term. We always define what region we're looking at. Are we looking at all of Canada? Are we looking within provinces or cities? And we want to think very carefully about what surveys are actually covering and who they're asking questions of. We're going to come back to that. Now, the labor force, when we talk about that, we're talking about representing those individuals in that eligible population who participate in paid labor market activities. Now, here we're looking at everybody who is employed, so they have a job, they're working, or they are unemployed and they are actively seeking work. They also have to be available. Now, everyone else is considered not in the labor force. This is going to include everyone who is doing work that is not paid, so they don't receive a wage or salary for the work that they do. They might be doing something like caregiving. That's certainly work for the most part, but they might also be retired. They might also be students who aren't employed at the moment. Now in Canada, we rely quite heavily on Statistics Canada for most of this information. So it's good to know how they get their numbers and really what it all means. We rely on a survey called the Labor Force Survey. Every month, Statistics Canada interviews about 56,000 households, which then includes about 100,000 individuals. Their eligible population for this survey is not the entire population in Canada. Rather, where they're looking at the civilian non-institutional population age 15 and over. Now, so that's going to exclude anyone who's living in any kind of long-term care facility, living in a hospital, for instance, living in prison. They would not be interviewed in this survey. They are not considered part of our eligible population. We also don't interview children, for that matter. And you'll notice that large parts of the Indigenous population in Canada is not surveyed either. Part of the reason for that is the cost of collecting data in very remote areas, but there are also some important historical and political reasons for that that we can get into in our workshops. Now, overall, the population that is surveyed represents about 31 million people in Canada. Of those, just over 20 million are considered part of the labor force. So we have a labor force participation rate here of 65.4%. In that labor force, just over 19 million people were employed in January 2020. 19 million out of 31 million gives you an employment rate here of 61.8%. Another 1.2 million people, or 1.12 million people, were unemployed. Now remember, the unemployment rate is that 1.12 million out of the 20.28 million in the labor force, not the entire eligible population. So we have an unemployment rate of 5.5% in January 2020. Now, what does it mean to not be in the labor force? We have 10.72 million people who are not in labor force in Canada in 2020. Well, if you fit in with the eligible population, but you are not working or unemployed, you will be considered not in the labor force. Notice that if you are a student who is searching for work, you're not considered unemployed. You're not in the labor force. Why? It is expected that you are not available in a more typical sense since you are busy in class, and any job search is really looking for work after you're done with your courses. Now, this is what the participation rate has looked like historically in Canada. I think there's a lot of interesting stories in here, some of which we'll get into, but for now, we have this big picture view. So if you look back to the earlier part of the 20th century, you'd see men's participation rates at over 90%, but they have steadily declined since then. Part of this will relate to the introduction of benefits that allowed people to stop working earlier and enter retirement for a while. But in more recent decades, we've seen men's participation drop in every recession and never quite recover. It's fallen quite steadily over the past decade. For women, it's a very different story. Very few women participated in paid work early on in the 20th century. And then after 1961, we see a steady increase in their participation. You'll see part of this had to do with women gaining the ability to control when they have kids, but also had better opportunities over time. Now, in more recent years, that participation rate has very much flattened out, but we'll have to wait and see where that goes moving forward, as that gap between men's and women's participation rates has diminished over time. Now, how does Canada compare with other countries? Here, I've pulled out the participation rates similar to those found in table 2.1 of your text, but sorted them by the overall participation rate of men and women combined. So for example, Jordan has the lowest overall participation rate at 41%, and Sweden has the highest at 83%. But what is presented here in this graph is the participation among men and among women separately. So for example, in Jordan, 67% of men and 15% of women are labor force participants. So what can we say here? First, most of the differences across countries and overall participation rates can be attributed to differences in women's participation rates. The difference for men across countries are not nearly as big. Second, there seems to be a positive relationship between a country's level of economic development and higher participation rates among women. And we can see this in our next slide a bit more clearly. This is similar to figure 2.3 in your text. Here, we've created a couple of scatter plots and tried to point out Canada for you over there. In the top figure, we show the relationship between countries' gross national income and women's participation rates. The upward sloping best fit line there represents a strong positive relationship between the two outcomes. In the bottom figure, we show GNI and men's participation. While there's a slight positive relationship, the best fit line is much, much flatter. But recognize there's a lot more going on in each country. Try to compare countries with similar levels of income, but with very different participation among women. So for example, Egypt and Peru in that top graph are in the same range of income, but there's a 49 percentage point difference between women's participation rates in those two countries. Now, to characterize the total amount of work being done in a country, you need to know more than just how many people are working or looking for work. If two people are sharing a job to avoid temporary layoffs, each working with reduced hours, is that really the same as two people working full-time permanent positions? Of course not, and we want to characterize that. When we think about how much people work, we have to think beyond a standard 40-hour work week, and also think about time away, people taking on extra jobs, and overall the patterns at which they are working. So here we start by making a distinction between the decisions on the extensive margin and the intensive margin. The extensive margin is asking, are you working? Are you working a little bit or not at all? It's an on or off kind of thing. The intensive margin is characterizing how much you are going to work if you decide to do so. So more generally, we like to think in terms of work hours. That's on that intensive margin. For individuals, it will offer a clear image of how much people work. And when we want to aggregate up how much people are working, the aggregate hours worked in Canada will give us a much better picture of exactly how much people work. Now, this bar chart is similar to figure 2.4, in your text, using the labor force survey per 2019 to show how much people typically work. The standard 40-hour work week is fairly typical, but in Canada, it's also common to see standard full-time jobs, which we define as 35 or 37.5 hours per week. Now, basically, these are 8-hour days. People are working 5 days a week, but the lunch hour isn't paid. So you're really paid for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, and working 35 hours. Now, women are much more likely than men to be in these jobs, such as the 35 or 37.5-hour work weeks, so that if you included those work weeks in a definition of standard work weeks, 58% of men and 51% of women are working those standard full-time jobs. The gap and the difference between men and women there doesn't seem all that different that way. But there are still differences. Women are more likely to work part-time, and men are more likely to put in hours over 50 hours per week. Now, in our next video, we start working through our most basic model of labor supply, which is going to help us frame why we might see some of these differences in work hours across individuals. See you then.